And finally, we need to discuss egalitarianism and healthcare. So, as we've been saying this whole entire time, all these different theories of justice believe that we need to treat equals equally. But that principle is ambiguous all on its own, and we need to give it particular content. So we've seen how the libertarian, both the right and left-leaning libertarians, give content to that idea. We've seen how the utilitarian gives content to that idea. And finally, we need to look at how the egalitarian gives content to that idea. The problem, though, with discussing the egalitarian content to that principle is that there are so many different versions of egalitarianism. And they all have different views about how we treat others as equals. So, for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to focus in on one very common thread in the egalitarian thinking, in the egalitarian literature. And so this popular version claims that, look, everybody should be treated equally. And how we do that is by making sure everybody has equality of opportunity. All right, so equality of opportunity is roughly the idea that people who have the same ambitions and talents should have sort of the same chance at getting to the positions they care about. If they put in the same amount of effort, then they should both end up being able to attain the jobs that they care about. So one easy way to get an understanding about this is to look at examples. All right, so if our United States legislator was only open to white landowning males, then that would be a system that lacked equality of opportunity, because particular positions, important positions of power, would be restricted to only a certain class of citizens. Right, so African Americans, Mexican Americans, none of them would have a chance at getting into those offices. So equality of opportunity is violated in that scenario where only white people can hold office. So one way you can get equality of opportunity is just to make sure that there are no sort of racial or sex discriminations in job or position availability. Another example to try and drive the point home is that in the current U.S. education system, we have children who have both the same level of ambition and the same natural talents, yet these children don't all have the same opportunities to be successful and find the same type of high-paying jobs, because our education is funded by the taxation system, by the property tax system. And so some children who have the same level of ambition and talent will just receive a worse education than others. Those who grow up in an affluent area, the taxes are a little bit higher, or the tax amount is a little bit higher, so the schools have more funding to work with. Those in low income areas, there's less to tax on, so the amount that the school gets is less. And so those children, just by that nature of the taxation system, the funding system, receive a worse education. So you could have two children, one in poverty, one in affluence, and they have the same ambition and natural talent, but their opportunities aren't the same because their education differs so drastically. So in such a case, egalitarians who worry about equality of opportunity say, all we need to do is tax people and redistribute that income so that everybody receives at least the same basic minimum of education. So taxation is justified in that case so that we can make sure everybody has the same basic minimum, and we need to make sure everybody has the same basic minimum so that they have equality of opportunity. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody has to have top-notch education, right? It doesn't mean that some people can't use their own personal funds to go get more education than everybody else. It just means that we need to make sure everybody has a basic minimum so that they are competitive or have the intellectual tools to be competitive. Okay, so how does all of this apply to healthcare? Right? Well, obviously, healthcare and equality of opportunity are going to be related, right? So if you don't have healthcare, right, without healthcare, many of us who suffer bad luck and get sick, or just get sick and can't afford the care, will not have equality of opportunity, since those who are lucky and don't get sick, or at least are lucky enough to be able to afford the treatments, are going to be at a competitive advantage automatically, right? So we're going to need to provide at least some level of health care, some base decent minimum, so that people are able to compete, that a stroke of bad luck doesn't suddenly knock them out of the competitive marketplace for opportunity. However, as we saw with the utilitarian theory, just because we have this idea, right, that healthcare and egalitarianism go together, it doesn't tell us exactly what system we need to put in place. So some people have said, look, egalitarians should want everybody to have access to the best healthcare possible. How we treat everyone equally is we make sure everybody gets the best healthcare possible, and then there won't be any health issues to put anybody at a disadvantage, so everybody will have equality of opportunity. Norman Daniels, who you read this week, says, no, that's not the case. Egalitarianism does not recommend that everyone has to have the access to the best healthcare possible. Why would that be? Well, this closely relates to this next idea, right? One might think that equality of opportunity requires us to use healthcare to improve the capabilities of those at a disadvantage. And so one example of this is that often in our system of democracy, voters take attractiveness into account when choosing a candidate. It's just an unconscious bias that many voters have. They're more drawn to attractive people than they are ugly people. And so if you have one ugly and one attractive person who both want to run for office, the ugly one is at a competitive disadvantage automatically, right? It's something that voters try and account for, but it's just an unconscious bias we have that has been tested for. So does equality of opportunity require that we do something about the ugliness, right? If we have the healthcare that could improve those capabilities that put someone at a disadvantage, then maybe it requires that we use those capabilities. But that doesn't really make sense, right? Should we give the ugly candidate plastic surgery in order to eliminate the disadvantage? Should the public fund plastic surgery for that ugly person so that they have equal opportunity to be successful in their run for office? No, right? So both of these principles, right? Everybody should get access to the best healthcare. Everybody gets access to any healthcare that eliminates competitive disadvantages. Both of those are bad principles. Those are not things that the egalitarian would recommend. And Daniels notes this. Daniel says, no, that's insane. If society had limitless resources, then that would be fine. Right? Then sure, let's give this person plastic surgery so everybody's equal. Let's make sure everybody has access to the best healthcare. But that's simply not the case, right? Our theory does have to take into account our limits, and so particularly our resource limits. So if society has resource scarcity, as ours does, then the egalitarian would not recommend either of those two principles. They also have to account for efficiency and liberty. And so Daniel says, look, the egalitarian could do two things. Right? One, they could give everybody the best healthcare possible, but obviously that's going to be wildly costly, and it's going to hurt equality of opportunity in other places. For example, if we have to provide everybody with the best healthcare possible, we're not going to be able to fund a good education, and so people are going to lack the education that they need to be competitive. On the other hand, the egalitarian could just simply make up for those disadvantages that people have in the competitive marketplace through income redistribution, right? So the egalitarian could do two things. They could account for the disadvantage by eliminating it with expensive healthcare, or they could make up for the disadvantage by redistributing income. Well, which one is more efficient? Obviously, the income redistribution is more efficient than providing everybody with the best healthcare possible. So the egalitarian can simply do that. So, okay, that doesn't yet tell us what medical system we're supposed to put in place yet. Daniel says, look, given that we have resource scarcity and liberty, what we should do is simply provide everybody with health care that will maintain their normal functioning. In other words, we give everybody the health care that's going to bring them back to the status quo, right? To bring them back to how they would have been naturally before they were unlucky and were struck down by illness. One example of this would simply be prescriptions for antibiotics, right? If somebody's sick, they get hit, then we should provide them with antibiotics because that's a very cheap and efficient way of returning them to their natural functioning. Now, this seems to treat everybody as equals. It seems to give everybody equality of opportunity because it restores their normal function and allows them to compete for their opportunities. But we still have an issue, and this isn't a big issue. This is the same issue we saw with utilitarianism. It doesn't eliminate all of the controversy, right? Because we're still going to have to determine what that basic minimum is, right? We say that we need to return everybody to normal functioning, sure, so that means we need to have a decent minimum of health care, but what does that decent minimum look like, right? What treatments should be included in that decent minimum? Does society have the resources for those treatments? Would those resources be better spent elsewhere in order to secure opportunity? For example, by spending on education. So we're still going to end up with these problems about system relativity that we talked about with utilitarianism. But the main takeaway is to see that egalitarians aren't required. Their theory doesn't necessitate some grand universal healthcare in which we dump all of this money into healthcare to give everybody the best treatment possible. Instead, it just requires that we give everybody a decent minimum of healthcare because that would restore their ability to compete and have equality of opportunity. Now, there is one issue here that we need to think about, and it's an intuitive issue for egalitarianism. So if we only need to provide treatments which maintain our normal function so that we can have equality of opportunity, what does this do for all end-of-life care? Right, so an important part of the medical field, something that many people feel entitled to, is end-of-life care. Right, like I'm dying, I really can't afford the palliative care that I need, but I have a right to that. I should be protected in my final years from the worst parts of my illnesses. So it would seem, if equality of opportunity is what we're really worried about, then those who are terminal really don't have an opportunity left, right? There's nothing more to compete for. They're terminal. So then maybe they shouldn't get any publicly funded treatments. Maybe terminal patients should only get treatment if they can afford it privately or personally. So I'll leave that to you, whether or not you find that counterintuitive or whether that sounds like the right outcome to you. But that might be an implication of the equality of opportunity position, right? Because there's no more competing for any opportunities at that point. There doesn't seem to be a right to a decent minimum of healthcare for them anymore. But that would still secure a right to a decent minimum for a majority of people and a majority of sicknesses in the U.S. that mess with or eliminate our normal functioning. Okay, so what are we supposed to conclude from all of these lectures about justice? Well, the most important thing is that a decent minimum of health care is compatible with all three major theories of justice, even though they all get to that idea in different ways. So, in contrast to what you commonly hear in U.S. political discourse, right, a decent minimum is morally justified, and we may tax people's income to secure it. Right? Often in our political discourse, we see right libertarians saying, no, taxation is theft. Nobody has a right to other people's actions or services. But that's just simply not true. Even libertarians can account for a decent minimum of health care within their theory. So it seems like morally we should be trying to change our national policy so that everybody at least has a decent minimum of health care. However, and here's the second large takeaway from all of these lectures, there's still going to be a lot of controversy and a lot of questions that need to be answered because we're still going to have this idea of system relativity. So the question is going to be, what does the basic minimum of healthcare look like in the U.S.? What treatments are we going to need to put in there? How much funding for them? if it comes down to a competition, like how are we going to separate who gets the treatment and who doesn't, so on and so forth, right? So we should have a decent minimum, but it's not clear what that minimum looks like. Thank you.